Hi guys and welcome. This is Jen Gaeta Siciliano, artist, memoir writer, bipolar psychiatric survivor, and your host of Not As Crazy As You Think podcast, the place that offers an alternative perspective on mental illness, highlighting creativity, non-conventional healing, and breaking on through to the other side. If you are ready for a new narrative on the mental realm that celebrates crazy and cool without penalty, then Not As Crazy As You Think is for you. Hello, this is Jen Gaeta Siciliano from Not As Crazy As You Think podcast. Thank you for joining us again today. Wow, we are so lucky to have Vesper Moore back for a part 2 session. Vesper, thank you so much for coming last time. For those of you who didn't listen to part 1, please do. But if you're just tuning in now, let me tell you a little bit about Vesper. Vesper is a mad liberation activist, trainer, writer, and psych survivor, COO of Kiva Centers. It's a community center that offers a variety of peer support meetings. People could gather together and tell their stories and share their experiences on madness and mental distress. Vesper, you're a huge mover and shaker in this mad movement for several years, fighting for all of us, steering the course in alternative healing to mental distress. Thank you so much for coming back.
Thank you for having me. It's always great to be here.
You know, you mentioned that you're an Indigenous person. You identify as a mad queer Indigenous person, which gives you great insight in terms of how psychiatry is involved with kind of recolonizing and re-injuring, all people who have been colonized before and additional people who don't fit into the scope of what the white man says is normal. Tell me a little bit about your roots and what land or ancestral land are you on now, if you want to describe that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, I always like to say in my land acknowledgements that the land belongs to no one. But, the land in which I am on has ancestral ties to the Nipmuc. And my family is Taino Arawak. We hail from the Caribbean, more distinctly the Dominican Republic and parts of Puerto Rico. And that ancestral connection to the Taino is so important for a lot of mixed race Hispanic people. My family is directly of the Quisqueya tribe. And the Quisqueya tribe, we were very much people of the earth. We utilized a lot of the earth and spaces when we built things. For example, dried palm leaves and sticks and mud we would use to build bohios, which were our homes. The Taino, which actually just means kind person, kind and inviting person. The Taino were responsible for creating what people know as canoes today. We refer to them as canoa. And we were also responsible for barbecue, which we would call barbacoa, and a lot of the traditions that we know today, even hamaca, which are hammocks. So a lot of these traditions and tools were things that came of the earth that don't only translate in largely the Caribbean context and Caribbean nations, but also translate in America and the United States.
Certainly. I mean, see, that's something, contributions in general. Nobody knows about these things unless people have to be asked about this. This is fascinating. I had no idea.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's interesting how certain ideologies, tools, and invention that are indigenous knowledge that just exist in our day to day, and we don't actually know that it's indigenous knowledge otherwise. Often because that history is not celebrated or that language is not maintained, and therefore the culture isn't treated as valid.
Right. And, it's so funny because this kind of segues right so beautifully into psychiatry that we like to talk about so much, because the entire structure is designed around looking at certain things as being advanced or more normal or appropriate, and then other things as being primitive or, abnormal or not related to reality. When a lot of those experiences that people have, they are similar in their, I guess, texture and substance as what many people have experienced in indigenous communities with shamanism and being able to have gifts of insights, whether it be visions or hearing voices. And speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. In Taino Heritage, in our teachings, it's so important that often in our lives, at some point, we will hear the calling of the earth. So often we refer to it as the heartbeat of the earth. You can hear the heartbeat of the earth, and that often our ancestors are in the cosmos or in the stars. Their souls, are of life and are there, and that often, for us, a lot of the what we refer to as and what a lot of anthropologists often think of in Taino heritage as gods are actually ancestors. So there's this idea, right, in a Christian dominant society that this is what a god or a deity would look like, that it is singular, it is of singularity. In our belief, it is of multiplicity. We all contribute to life, the cosmos, the universe, everything. We're interconnected in that way. Therefore, our ancestors, who may be responsible for contributing to the elements and the earth, are often those who we offer space for and we contribute to, and I guess in quotes worship, but like I don't like to think of it as worshiping. I like to think of it as contribution, offering to our people, our culture, our ancestors, our elders, and what they've offered us. And I guess all of this really ties in because if you are a grieving person who is speaking to someone in your life, a family member or someone else who may have died or passed away, that there's an expectation that, okay, in the moment, if you're grieving, fine. But if you continue to do this, for any long extended period of time, you are a crazy person. You are this, you are that, right? When in fact, this communication with people who are dead and exist and manifest in another way, if you will, which is when we get into spirituality, right? That communication is natural,
right?
That should be present. And I think that a disconnection to actually speaking to the voices that we hear and having that communication, it plays a larger role in the disconnection that we experience in a westernized society, our westernized society.
Right. The whole idea of hearing voices, I do want to get more involved with the hearing voices community because I really haven't, and it's like something I should have by now. But a lot of people who experience it heavy sometimes report that the voices are scary, that there's a level of distress that it's hard for them to kind of, handle on a daily. Do you believe that if we approached these voices differently, if we kind of reevaluated where we stand in relation to ourselves and the universe and that spiritual realm and, on another level where these voices might have more, weight or what have you, do you think if we kind of reteach, I guess our young or whatever, that there's another possible alternative explanation for these things? I mean, maybe that kind of discourse could start.
Yeah, I think it's and I think I spoke a little bit about this last time, that it's foundational. If we alter how we perceive hearing voices, or how we understand our experience around it, or where our connection to these voices come from, and how, and that it's a completely natural experience, that uh, in turn we would be a little bit less distressed about it. Would we still hear distressing voices? Likely, yes, but we would have a method in how to communicate and work through when the voices are distressing.
Right, right. Those coping skills that are never taught, discussed, thought of, nothing. And so you're thrown into this like pit, of like this void, not knowing what to think. But because there's like this blank slate especially when you're hospitalized, you're just retaught. And that's part of the therapy, isn't it? Like kind of wiping the slate clean and then reteaching you cognitive ways of, processing your world.
Yes, yes.
One of the things that you mentioned is that a lot of the people in charge, they don't understand the suffering of oppressed groups. So how do we bridge that? Like if we are to talk about, hey, let's look at what these people are really suffering from. If you look at international mental distress, they talk a lot about existential issues in the Western world. And then on, say, the global South or whatever, they talk about something like survival issues, because they can't always, feed their families. So these are like different mental distress factors. Like, why isn't that, really brought to the forefront in our American system? Why don't we discuss those things? Do you think that it's just because we became so isolationist that we don't really even think about it?
Yeah, we became isolationist, and I also think a part of that has to do with the industrialization of human society, and an advancement in quotes in a lot of respects. I think it's important to think about how a state of productivity and creation has really impacted our society, and how we've decided that if people can't contribute to that, then they are almost purposeless. When we think about ourselves societally, like as a collective. And the thing is that we're not purposeless. Our purpose is really inherent and of our own definition, if you want to call it a purpose. And I think with that, that narrative, along with an inherent fear of human distress, an inherent fear of disability, contributes further to that. I think, also just not having a lot of those foundational teachings, which generationally have been removed because it's only understood that you can have these spiritual abilities or connections, or can really speak to beings that are not physically there, if you yourself are either God, Jesus, or the Holy Ghost, right? If that's the ideal, like only those folks, or only these who are selected, right, by this God, by this deity, that you can do this. And if you're taught all of this, right, and you have a spiritual experience, or you experience something distressing, or something else happens in that respect, because one, you do not have that foundational understanding of how to approach this, and two, you're told that you're not supposed to be able to do it, or if you do it, there's something wrong with you, right? Like you may be possessed, you may be disabled, or there it always has to be like, in order for you to have this type of connection or experience things in this type of way where you seem to lose control. I think control also has to do with it. There's an inherent fear of loss of control too. Then there's something wrong with you, right?
Yeah. Yeah. You've mentioned how in indigenous cultures, there's not really that much policing that goes on around states of consciousness and being. And, you know, in the mental health industry here, it's all about policing. I know in New York is just terrible. I mean, I've been a receiver of harm and abuse because of something like Kendra's Law on the books. Kendra's Law basically states that, you know, if you have a certain amount of hospitalizations in a given small period of time, then you could automatically be hospitalized without really any proof of anything except your label. So that's happened to me a couple of times. And it just struck me as like, this is the absolute loophole for putting people away without trial in this country. And so this incarceration is just, you know, something that's so prolific in this country. How did we get here? I mean, how do we change things? How does the community come together to rip up what is there and try something new?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, there's a level of political polarization, I think, in the United States and internationally that is very understandable as to why it's there. There are systems that are designed that are not accessible to us and are harmful. There's a commercialization of our distress, if you will, and so many other things. You know, I wouldn't say that there is one clear-cut solution when we speak to this. I think when we think about what leads to emotional distress and what a lot of people may say a mental health diagnosis, it is etiological. There's so many components, right, to it that the reason why we end up this way or struggling in these ways is by that societal design. I think a big solution would be to really revisit how we understand distress and ourselves. I think a fear of not wanting to delve into the dangerous aspects of ourselves, the dangerous aspects of each other are a big part of the conversation. But yeah, I mean, to answer your question, some of these solutions is I think it would be great for parents and family members and guardians and elders, right, to have conversations with young adults about other states of being, emotional distress, feeling disconnected, feeling so hopeless that we want to take our lives, right? And actually engaging in that conversation, right? And being like, you have the complete autonomy to feel this way and the right to feel this way. But let's see how we can work through it if you're willing to work through it, right? Or willing to have the conversation. And I think the earlier on we have this in life, right, the more important that conversation will be and the more it'll resonate and stay with us as we go in through a journey of what is, you know, life and being alive.
Yeah. Yeah. You also mentioned, I think this ties in, how the psychiatric approach, they don't honor the normal risk in life. You had said you honor the risk, allow people to exist in their danger. And, you know, it's so important because, you know, I've heard a lot of people who have been suicidal talk about, or even people who just had mentioned that they felt like life wasn't worth living, whatever. And there's such a immediate and pretty like hostile intervention. that they regret opening up about a feeling that most of us have experienced in one way or another. If we've been extremely depressed or, extremely overwhelmed with a grieving situation, where do we draw the line in terms of emergency response and allowing people to, go there and express and maybe just need to like connect and feel like they're normal in their pain and then like kind of work through it? What if you are in an extreme state where suicide is an issue? And then, the only treatment is to like zonk you out on antipsychotics. And then, so that you can't lift anything to hurt yourself, because that's how it can get in the hospital.
Yeah, I've always had this question when particularly with peer respites and crisis alternatives, it's like if someone's actively, suicidal and they're experiencing feelings around suicide, won't they just jump out the window? Won't they just go into the kitchen and grab something and hurt themselves? Won't they just do this? Won't they just do that? And I always argue, if you have an environment where you can openly speak about, suicide, openly speak about these things without any form of shame or concern about what's going to happen to you, that having that established trust is so important to that environment, and that it's more likely someone's not going to do that.
Right. I know personally people like my cousin, he was put on these terrible medications that time. And that's why he committed suicide. A lot of people, they just can't take it anymore. And I know that there's lots of evidence of this. People talk about it all the time with, the pharmaceutical takeover of so many of our lives. I was so disabled in my 20s. I could barely talk, read, anything. So I know that this is continuing to happen, where a lot of times the drugs themselves just make you want to.
Yes. And I mean, that's a whole other separate element about how the psych drugs, which are designed in respect to, by design, what they do is its intention is like, oh, okay, someone would use these drugs in the short term as they're experiencing distress, but they end up being recommended in a way, and once on, not knowing how to withdraw, right, you end up being on them for a lifelong time, right, or a very long time, and it ends up being disabling. It ends up causing, these illnesses in your body that like are actually killing you. Yeah. And that's why we have such a high mortality rate as psych survivors and as disabled people. On top of everything else, on top of, trauma and its impact on our physical body because of the emotional distress and the reaction to the amygdala, and then that leading to the rush of cortisol in our body, and that like state of constant like stress and hypertension in our body, causing our heart to beat quickly, right, and impacting our overall health. Then you have the added factor of medications, difficult environments, more traumatizing events, and then inherent shame that you have to live in, right? And isolation, maybe in closed quarters, maybe not, maybe living on the streets, right? In very, very rough weather and conditions. And you're not going to live long.
Right. There are just certain identities that the system doesn't really wrap their arms around. One thing that you said, and I can't remember which of the panels that you mentioned, you've been on so many great panels, I've watched so many of them. And you said, how many human identities actually have to be a diagnosis until we realize that mental illness is a farce? You want to go further with that?
I do. and I do want to come in with the amendment. If you're someone who identifies with mental illness and you understand the historical oppression and the current oppression and a lot of those other contexts, right, and you feel truly in yourself, your experience with emotional distress feels like an illness in your body that is disabling, and you identify as mentally ill, you're completely valid I'm there with you. I get it. But I think it is the default of mental illness that is the problem in our society. The fact that that is the default, and the fact that it is designed in this way to bill for the diagnoses that we receive, to hold us in these institutions longer, to assign us these medications, and a lot of the treatment that comes from privatized industry, and the fact that psychiatry as a profession isn't well regulated.
Right.
The fact that a lot of these pharmaceutical medications and a lot of the research coming out about them is done by marketing researchers who are hired by that private pharmaceutical company to only talk about what are some of the positives, and only skim over some of those negative effects, right? Whenever you hear those commercials, right, that are always like, oh, it can do this for your life, and then you have like a lot of this really fast muttering that's talking about the horrible conditions it could do to your body, right? And that's
a nightmare.
Yeah, I mean, even if that drug is like in the public sphere and being covered and talked about, because there's a lot of them that aren't, right? And then I think that begs the question: what actually is informed consent? If we're not taught how to withdraw from the medications, if it can be, recommended that it is increased, and we are not deemed competent enough to have a deciding factor in it, right? What is informed consent? If you have to go inside of a psychiatric facility, right? Or if you're going voluntarily rather, and you can't decide when to leave, what is informed consent? What is autonomy in this context? It's not there. So when I talk about oppressed identities, I mean in the historical context, and I mean homosexuality as a diagnosis. I mean BIPOC people receiving a variety of diagnoses, right, or diagnoses around the societal oppression that we've experienced. Trans people being a diagnosis, and the issue with this is the fact that it is an overdiagnosing of the human experience, a pathology, if you will, that is leading us to think differently about the fact that we experience emotional distress because we are disconnected from one another and the earth we are on.
Right. I really do feel connected to the MAD community, I guess. I feel like what we do share is that suffering that we see more than others who are addicted, and actually, frankly, like cogs in the wheels of the machine, and they're going along nicely, again contributing to production in a capitalist society. They fit in just right, and then I always felt like when I was on the inside, like that was the chance to get with my misfits and talk about how we're going to change the world. I mean, like the dissidents on the inside quieted down, and the system works in that way. Mm-hmm. And then you leave and you're just like, wow, the only way to really fit in is to be like everybody else. Mm. And that's so sad, because I guess it speaks again to this, like the idea of identity loss, because so much of what makes me up is considered crazy by everybody else, but it's so normal for me that I always saw the separations of all the categories of the DSM, just like basically you're just delineating personality types. And if you notice, like nobody's really in there that's a great description of just the normal white man. And I'm going to say it. I don't care, because I've been eye to eye with these people all throughout my life. And even the BIPOC women who take on the role of the white man, speak to me in the same way through those eyes. So it is the language that we use that continually oppresses the future of this country and the world. It's the continual language. It's abusive after a while. You talk about reclaiming the term madness for ourselves, adopting the biomedical language for oneself with diagnosis. I mean, how do you see that? Do you feel that that could get in the way of mad liberation for oneself?
So there's a few things about this, right? So when people talk about brain science that relates to mental health diagnoses, so so often in the psychiatric survivor or MAD movement, we argue that the biomarker to many mental health diagnoses has yet to be found, and that's the pre-existing biomarker that is inherently there, a part of your brain chemistry. This is exactly where in the brain schizophrenia is, right? But you can detect in the brain the types of changes that the brain experiences as it relates to emotional distress, right? You can see the when someone's hearing voices, you can see what parts of the brain are engaged, right, in some types of ways. So a lot of people argue like there's your neurological evidence, is the fact that that's happening, right? And the fact that like there's these memory issues that are related with these diagnoses and all of that. And then I go back and I say, well, there's not, at least it hasn't been found yet, right, that there isn't anything that is pre-existing right there. And then I also argue, even if there was this pre-existing biomarker, let's say that there is, and then, you know, psychiatrists are throwing a huge party and they're like, yeah, we're right. Like mental illness, you know, like is the valid default, right? We should go this direction. The current perspective, right? That how mental illness has existed historically, the fact that that has been used against us,
right,
and has, you know, our autonomy as human beings has been stripped, and they're literally billing, right, for like the way in which we've been treated, that alone, I say, is the reason why we're fighting against this, right? We're fighting against the context and the social use of the term,
right,
in its harmful existing context. Now, when I talk about mad identities, I think it's important as a socio-political identity that can be interrelated, but also can be reclaimed independently of psychiatry, even though we can recognize that there's inherent interconnections as survivors of the psychiatric system, both directly and indirectly, right, with madness, that madness itself, these non-normative, if you will, the non-conventional states of being and existing and experiencing the world and engaging with the world, are a part of our human identity, or at least the way in which we understand our identity. So it should be valid that we're able to reclaim that, very similarly to how people reclaim the term queer, or how a lot of disabled people are reclaiming the term crip, short for cripple. In that ideology of like, okay, this term has historically been used against my people to oppress us in a social context. And I understand that my existence is treated as inherently criminal because of it. So in this social and political context, I am reclaiming it to then fight against the prejudices against my people. So it is extremely important when we talk about the validation of mad identity in our society, will be crucial to the trend of decarcerating disability and madness.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I could see how that, you know, can fuel more, I think, personal power. I know that so many people have been labeled, they just feel so like bad about themselves. In fact, recently I heard that, you know, there's so much involvement with school diagnosis still. And as much as like we're on the I guess you could call it the cutting edge of what people are discussing, the truth of it is it's so all encompassing in the school systems, and it starts so young that we'd have to, you know, like, I don't know. I mean, do we have to take it to the streets, like in ways like the late 60s? I don't know. To make that much of a, how do we do it?
The education system's a whole other thing. I mean, the education system operates off of a carceral mentality of punishment and reward. And regardless of how good the teachers or how good the institution tries to be, there's so much that's inherent in the foundation of that needs to be addressed. And I mean, that carceral mindset, again, I think is a part of it. The fact that we have to punish and reward each other, the fact that we think that that's right. I think has a lot to do with it. I mean, developmentally and how it impacts us throughout our lives. I do think that something that's super important when we talk about parents and parents' approaches to this is that there's two layers, right? When you're a young adult, you already do not have the same rights as adults in society if you are under a certain age, right? You cannot vote, you cannot consent to a lot of the things that can happen to your body medically, like a parent can decide that for you. Where you go during the day, where you live, where you are, a lot of that is decided for you, and that's just that's by design. By design, and there's a lot of issues with that, where we should be at least having transparent conversations about it. But then on top of that, when you receive a mental health diagnosis and you're a mad disabled person, that the additional factor is that now you are infantilized and oppressed within that, on top of the fact that you are a young adult. So I think that there is an intersection between mental health and youth and young adults as a social class of people that we don't often talk about. And that often in my work with young adults, we use a disability justice framework because access is at the center of disability justice. And then we think about where young adults do not have access and where that parallels, and how some of these teachings, some of the disabled or crip wisdom, if you will, that we have can be utilized and applied to the liberation of young adults in our society.
I watched some things that you were involved with, and they talked about that kind of, I guess, think of ageism as for old people, but it's also against young people, right? Mm-hmm. So yes. I thought that was so interesting, because as I was listening to these panels of very intelligent and insightful young people, I was thinking to myself, these people need to be in charge like immediately. Okay. We can't wait for them to like get all the experience and the credentials and everything else under their butt that time gives you, right? That's the idea. Like, you need to get credentialized in order to contribute to the society. And I'm sitting there thinking, what are we waiting for? Why can't the young people speak up and speak out and make decisions for us old people who are stuck in our ways, and really who are still in the system of our forefathers, you know what I mean? So it is an important thing, because, those are the people who made movements also in the late 60s. It was the youth.
I think it's yes. And I think that the very important piece to that too is that often youth and young adults go into social action, social change through demonstration, because they can't vote either. They don't have a political voice otherwise. They have to rise up, which is why you see a lot of this, even though I think we should rise up anyway. But I do want to say that Judy Chamberlain is from Massachusetts, and she lived till about 2010, and that was very, very early on. Like I was just starting to learn about some of this stuff, like right when she was on her way out. But some of her writings and some of the very things that she encountered, I see a repeat of now. I see a repeat of it happening now. She wrote this letter on co-optation and democracy that I read. And it was from a back and forth argument with another person in the movement about, whether or not we should accept public dollars to sustain our movement. And then, Judy was of like, yes, we need to accept these public dollars and we need to think critically of it. And we need to work with this, right? Because if we do not, our movement's going to die. Yeah. Right. And I see a lot of that now. I see the same parallel of, people avoiding public institutional dollars, which completely valid. I get it. Right. Mm-hmm. Or otherwise. But then I worry about movement sustainability and what's happening, because we're seeing it happen again. But it was also the acceptance, right, of federal dollars through national institutions that led to the co-optation of the psychiatric survivor movement, a lot of context, and the professionalization of what was originally consumer survivor case management aides that ended up becoming peer support workers, right? And then you ended up having this more workforce-driven approach where we're not talking as much about the grassroots social movements and social justice ideals. So it's kind of a two-sided thing here, right? We need to sustain our movement and our movement efforts, and then simultaneously we need to not, co-opt them. And what I mean by co-opt is take on the ideals of an institution or compromise our own for that institution.
I have experienced, I think personally, the loss of the movement. It seemed to be like there was things going on with, back in the day with R.D. Lang and, all these people and Saz and everybody. And then it got a bad rap because of Scientology. I think that Thomas Saz was familiar with.
Oh, he was
Ron
friends
Hubbard. Right?
With Ron Hubbard and was a Scientologist himself. Oh, really? So often when you even talk about anti-psychiatry now, sometimes I post things through Madness Network News and I have people being like, oh, this is just a bunch of Scientology stuff. And I'm just like, no, this is, utilizing Scientology as another tool to invalidate us.
Right.
It's just even worse. It's an added layer of difficulty, right?
We touched upon it last time, but once the 60s were over and that whole hippie movement got squashed quickly, mm-hmm. The right wing took over again. And listen, I have friends who are conservatives, who are Republicans. I don't have judgment against people who have conservative ideals. That's fine. But I expect to be accepted in the same way for my differences or for my belief systems as a human being with choices.
But then there's also, and I think that's so important historically, which is why myself as a younger person, right, who's doing this work, and I see the political polarization that exists today and how government and private industry can squash the efforts we're doing now.
Yes.
And what I take a look at is things like Cambridge Analytica and that and that scandal and the weaponization of information and the utilization of information to make to manipulate the public to either not vote or not have access to the information about voting or to be inappropriately targeted right through marketing campaigns and all that. And who does that belong to? It belongs to private industry, right? It belongs to the folks in Silicon Valley. And I think that it's so important that we talk about the utilization and weaponization of information, because that is the very reason why we have a mad movement. Partially is because of the fact that information through therapy and psychiatry has been weaponized against us. This mental health industrial complex functions very, very much off of that. And with that being said, I see private industries through other foreign governments that create social justice pages right on Facebook that people end up following, that end up sharing certain types of propaganda that actually feed into political polarization, that make us attack each other and then diffuse our movements. And that's something very real to be aware of. I think yes, it's so important that we talk about these ideals, and we have virtual spaces to do it, but we have to be ensuring that we're not being controlled by private industry while we're having these conversations. And it's very easy to get there, right? Because we're in our social media bubbles. Right. Our friends on our friends lists, right? They all seem to agree with us, or many of them at least, on a lot of our views politically. So whenever we may find someone who is disagreeing, we're just like, really? You're still doing this BS? Like, what the hell's going on here? Like, you know, it's like get with the program or get out, right? And it's like our tolerance goes down because we are only surrounded but when in fact, everyone is thinking very differently about a multitude of issues.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that we can't call people out, right? Or call them in, because I think that that's super important. But I think, again, recognize when, social control and private industry is a factor.
It's so great to have this kind of dialogue, because the truth of it is it's a hard conversation. There are no easy fixes. It got this way after many generations of layers upon layers of lies and manipulations and corruption. It's helped only half the people it's treated, because that's what the placebo effect of all these studies. And the people who are left harmed are really harmed. We're talking forced drugging. You know what I mean? Like, that's when you get into like weird shit. And that's what the mental illness industry really has benefited from. That's how they've grown, by just being the biggest drug pushers of our time. Bottom line is, the psychiatrist is the expert, right? And it's only based on his judgment that the truth is revealed. And you say, these people can put away politicians, police officers, social workers, any person of power, and deem them mentally ill. And then that's when, that unlimited, unchecked power is basically given over to them, and they have really, I guess, their hands upon the entire human population. We're talking like, this is like, again, like Holy Roman Empire stuff, because it's global. So now that it's moving globally, and so many other areas of the world are finding an issue with this as well, they are fighting back in other areas. So, like, I almost feel like there's more hope in those areas of the world who still have their roots, if they have the strength to create their own movements. I mean, do you know much about what's going on internationally in movements? Because I know that you have been in that discourse.
Yes. I mean, I can say that there are many different countries that are facing different circumstances when it relates to disability and psychiatric survivors and the psychiatric institution. And the reason why I say this is because, and I mean, internationally, politicians, define this, and they say developed and underdeveloped countries. And then they talk about how in underdeveloped, in quotes, countries, whatever the hell that means, right? That the forms of psychiatric treatment are more and more similar, right, to prisons, right? Even though I would argue any psychiatric institution operates like a prison, regardless of how nice you attempt to make the environment look. If the person cannot leave and the information is controlled, that it's going in and out, and it can be treated in this way, and they can have chemicals injected into their body against their will, that it is a prison of many contexts. But that there are inhumane conditions where disabled people are kept behind bars or metal doors, where they are not receiving the proper nourishment, or even have the proper access to the types of treatments they would like in different parts of the world. So often, here in the United States, we are fighting, for informed consent and for us to decide what we would like in terms of support, in terms of treatment, in terms of whatever, right? And rewriting that narrative. But then in different parts of the world, I feel like people are actively fighting for just basic treatments, right? And then when they reach that point where they would have the basic treatment, then they're going to realize an additional layer of how that is inhumane. And because those institutions don't have that conversation hasn't even begun, right? So when I have these conversations internationally and in different spaces with people, so much of it is like, okay, how are we focusing on having, just proper like spaces in the community, or even just proper living situations for people. Recently in Zimbabwe, they built they just constructed a psychosocial a national psychosocial disabilities network, which in a lot of contexts will be utilized to have these types of conversations.
Nice.
And in spaces like Singapore, where they have the psychiatric institution and a very much the struggle of authoritarianism, right? To a different degree, right? That they're looking to deinstitutionalize and build more in the community in the first place. And then there are places, around the world that are run by dictatorships, and those areas which are not connected to some of the international entities like the United Nations or the World Health Organization. The way in which they are approaching disabled people and mad people and treating them is just absolutely horrific.
Gosh.
Just it's all so different that again, there isn't one blanket way to address all of these issues. But I can say that in these conversations, that in our privilege in living in the United States or in European countries, if you're listening in European countries or Asian countries that are considered more well off than others, or African countries that are considered more well off than others, that it is imperative that we as activists with these resources support our own in different parts of the world. And I'm going to encourage everyone who's listening to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, it's kind of sad, but it's one of the, I guess, the notions that people in America believe, like, oh, the Americans have to lead the way. And yet we're so entrenched in a broken system. Do you feel that landscape is changing now? And I believe, after listening to many of these panels that you were part of, for the first time, I have hope that it might be with these young people who are coming out. I mean, do you have that foresight?
Yeah, I do. I think we have an opportunity that we need to seize. Yeah. We need to seize this opportunity. And the reason why I say that is because politically, at least in the United States, and I'm sure in actually many other countries, that we're going to face more and more of we have a majority conservative cabinet. And right now, we have a, in quotes, Democratic president, right, that is actually trying to appeal to conservative ideals and is still harmful because there's still detention centers and, murders happening and all sorts of things, right? But we're not on that. We're talking about psychiatry. But I think along with that, even still in the position that we're in, we can have some serious or facilitate some serious social awareness and emergence and awakening, right, around some of these ideals, that if we do it now, there'll be enough of a social push on the institutions to continue. Yeah. And I think that we're seeing some of it. I mean, the World Health Organization released a manual on peer support, community mental health. Mm-hmm. We're seeing more of that, right? We're seeing mainstream platforms, actors, politicians, athletes, everyone talking about mental health, right, and what does that mean, right? So once we open that conversation, they're going to talk about the mental health system that they know from the role of, like, it's supposed to help all of us, right? And you know, there's a lot of people who are engaging with the mental health system for the first time that haven't prior, and then they're going to have some of their own experiences. And our movement is large enough now where we will be there to really facilitate those conversations and talk more about the mental health industrial complex and the harm that's being caused in our society and the liberation of mad identities. And again, you know, the liberation of mad identities and you know, really building policy and law around discrimination on the basis of our identity will really, really support us as psychiatrists, you know, attempts to keep us longer in psychiatric institutions or attempt to incarcerate us in community, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the conversation is beginning. You're resurrecting so much of it because so much of it was lost. And I give that a lot of that credit to you, because I see how strong of a speaker you are in groups with other people who are doing the same thing, but you have a unique angle. And I feel like your voice speaks for many of us. So Vesper, really, thank you so much again for coming and sharing your wisdom. And you really are making the changes and the differences that we need to see in our society. And I appreciate that. And I thank you for that.
Absolutely. And I really want to preface that in our society, in our carceral capitalist society, there's so much on individuality. And earlier I was talking about, you know, in the United States and in other countries, how we should go and help, you know, and do some of this work, that we need to break out of that individualism, that siloing out from one another, and focus more and more on collectivism. Right. Can't emphasize that enough. So although I really appreciate what you said about my efforts, I think collectively we need to come together.
Yes. Once again, thank you so much. Check out Vesper's website at www.vespermore.com. You can follow Vesper on Instagram at Vesper_J_Moore, on Twitter at MoreVesper, on Facebook at Vesper Moore 777, and on LinkedIn at Vesper Moore. Thanks for listening to Not As Crazy As You Think, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And remember, mental health is attainable for anyone, especially those labeled with mental illness. Until next time, peace out.